Thank you very much, Dr. Lacefield. How y'all doing? Okay, I'll try not to do the gratuitous y'all anymore. It's great to be back in Kentucky again. It's great to be driving around saying, that didn't used to look like that. I graduated in '86. There's been a few changes, so it's wonderful to be here again this year. This is the title, Red Meat and Our Health, Separating Scientific Fact from Politics, Emotion, and Misinformation. Well, that should take a while. But here's the short version, the take-home version. This is what I like. There, you can leave now. Meat is medicine. Meat is medicine. We are awash in an epidemic of chronic illness in this country. In case you hadn't noticed it, there's a diabetes epidemic going on. In case you hadn't noticed, there's an obesity epidemic going on. In case you hadn't noticed, people are starting to talk about diabesity because those two conditions are so tightly related. You are living in the diabetes belt. And the product of your effort, the product of your industry is the best solution to correcting both of those conditions. So let's talk about that just a little bit. Let's start by just thought experiment, because I need to get people to understand what they are just assuming as part of the background conversation. So if somebody starts talking about a healthy diet, what sorts of things do you think they're assuming go into making up a healthy diet? Whole grain, I heard over here. That's certainly one of them. Protein, I heard. Any specific notion about where that protein comes from in the common conception? Non-animal protein. I heard something over here. Fruits and vegetables. Yeah, that's another one. Okay? So where does all that idea come from? Well, where it comes from is what is embodied in what's called heart-healthy diet. And this comes from a notion of a diet-heart link that started in the 50s. What you may not understand is how tenuous that was based on any touch with reality. That was one man's conception that he pushed very hard and got it to be the official dietary policy of the United States. It's quite remarkable once you start to look at it. But what it ended up with is this. This is a version of what was produced by the United States Department of Agriculture to tell us how we ought to eat. Ultimately, that specific diet came to be the recommended diet for every American over the age of 2, including pregnant and lactating women. Where's your product located on that? Toward the top, yeah. It's supposed to eat less. What's that based on? It may come as a surprise to you that much of what we today accept as healthy eating comes from vegetarianism. These two particular gentlemen did more to transform the breakfast table of the United States than anyone else I can think of. John Harvey Kellogg, you may recognize that name. Sylvester Graham, you may recognize that name from break time in kindergarten. Yeah, it was his cracker. That was one of his health foods. These people believed that eating meat led to all the diseases that were being seen. And they had some weird ideas of what was going on, and those people were fired in part by their religious beliefs, and that has filtered down to us today. Is there any basis to that belief? Again, as was said, if somebody does not want to eat meat, that's fine with me, but I have a real problem when it's the dietary policy of the United States. I have a real problem when that dietary policy is about to be ensconced in our healthcare system, a la the new insurance, all right? So I got a few problems, insert line here, no, about this. And we have this weird, as a nation, we've had a very bizarre relationship with food. It's completely unlike any other culture, and some sociologists should do a study on this. But health food, again, goes back to Kellogg and Harvey and it comes forward to today. And we have these really bizarre notions, and unfortunately a lot of that leaks out into general population. There's a lot of buzz about sustainability. I believe that sustainability starts with profitability. If there's no profit, there's no sustainability. There's a lot of things that are part of the sustainability dialogue that I don't agree with. This is the best definition that I've found for sustainability: meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. I like that one. I think we can all get behind that one. But this one surely must include human nutrition. Can there be sustainability if we don't understand nutrition? Well, how well do we understand nutrition? You'd like to think we do. Well, let's have a little test, shall we? If I say cholesterol, do you think essential or harmful? Oh, what happened? Back up. No cheating. So we're back to cholesterol. Is it a harmful thing or an essential thing? It's an essential thing. There are genetic disorders where people cannot produce enough cholesterol because we can't eat enough. Our bodies make the majority of cholesterol. It's in every cell in our bodies. And these poor, unfortunate human beings that have this disorder die very early in utero development. Must not be good. Everybody heard of good cholesterol? Everybody heard of bad cholesterol? Anybody can tell me what LDL cholesterol is? Is that good or bad? It's bad. It's in that bad category. And anybody tell me what HDL cholesterol is? Good. Process of elimination. That was a tough one, wasn't it? Okay. What's the difference in the cholesterol? Don't say one's good, one's bad. Don't do that. What's the difference? There's none. Cholesterol is cholesterol. You might need to write that down. There's no difference in the cholesterol. The difference is in the lipoprotein molecule that it's bundled in to transport it through the body. So why do we focus on cholesterol? Well, because that's what we started measuring. And we started measuring it way before we knew what we were measuring. And we can't stop now, because we'd have to admit that we really didn't know what we were looking at. Maybe I'm being harsh, but let's see. Saturated fat. If you hear or see the phrase saturated fat, does the modifying phrase artery clogging spring to mind? It's almost like you have to put all that together if you write anything in the public literature about saturated fat. Is there any truth to the idea that saturated fat clogs arteries? Well, we'll see. Do you think if we put a Basset on a treadmill, we can turn it into a Greyhound? Genetics ain't fair, is it? You might get a lean Basset. Might. Those of us who are genetically predisposed to fatten easily, the easy keepers, might not be able to get as lean as we'd like to be, because that's different than as lean as we can be. And some of us who are predisposed to fatten are a little tired of the lean 20-something-year-olds telling us how they got that way when all that happened was they won the genetic lottery. Right? They were born on third base, they think they hit a triple. Do you really believe you are what you eat? Here's a clue. They ain't grass. We are what our bodies do with what we eat, and it's a profound difference. If you see a heavy person, do you think lazy glutton or perturbed metabolism? If you subscribe to the official dietary policy of the United States, you believe the former. You may not be so cold and bold as to consciously think or say that, but the official policy of the United States government is that obesity is the result of overeating and sedentary behavior, a la lazy glutton. They eat too much, they don't exercise enough. there's just one problem with that. There's no basis in the scientific literature to justify that position. But they have never let that stop them. How do you make money from grass? You make money feeding grass to cows? That's great. Wow, Kentucky, you have brought an advancement in Kentucky agriculture. You make money by selling the product. I guess that's the point. So yeah, we convert grass into a saleable product. So grass makes milk. We sell milk. Grass makes meat. High quality animal protein and animal fat. But now we try to sell it into a prejudiced marketplace. And we could have a real long discussion about how it came that we lost our fear of God or communism. But we're here today to talk about our fear of fat. Fat was mentioned earlier. The clear evidence of all anthropology and all archaeology is that we are by nature meat-eating cooks. You don't need this kind of vision system to gather rhubarb. You need this kind of vision system when you're trying to hunt something or escape being hunted. Well, actually, you probably need a different one if you're trying to escape being hunted. You'd like to be able to see behind you better. But that's why we work in bands, so somebody can keep track of the 6 o'clock. So how did we get to a point where something so fundamental to human development and well-being as animal fat came to be demonized? It's a very interesting question. I wish I had the time to really go into it for you, and I gotta try to push through this. But let me just give you a sense of where we were. In the 30s, poor health was blamed on a lack of meat and dairy products in the diet. That's in the 1930s. Here's a quote for you. 1963, British Journal of Nutrition. Every woman knows that carbohydrates are fattening. This is a piece of common knowledge which few nutritionists would dispute. But in the 60s, we swapped the paradigm that carbohydrate makes us fat for the paradigm that dietary fat causes heart disease, that diet-heart hypothesis. Such that by the 80s, we had people writing that obesity was a carbohydrate deficiency. Serious. You can't get fat if you don't eat fat. Anybody remember skinless chicken breasts? Anybody remember oat bran? Anybody remember the big bowls of pasta that you could eat and not get fat? Well, guess what? Wrong. You know, they don't call it a beef belly. Well, why do you think they call it a beer belly? It's the carbohydrate. It was well understood that carbohydrate is a uniquely fattening macronutrient. But because heart disease became the infatuation of the establishment in the United States, because of the destruction of the research community in Europe in World War II, all of the science that had been going on, that community was destroyed, and then it was marginalized post-World War II by Americans who reinvented the discipline. So, briefly stated, that swapping of paradigms was a mistake. Some have called it the greatest scientific deception of our time, the notion that animal fat causes heart disease. This was by one of the researchers and authors of the Framingham Report. So, brief review. Your diet is made up of what I just said, macronutrients. You've got fat, protein, and carbohydrate. Now, across a range of diets, your protein content isn't going to vary that much. Okay? But if you're going to drive fat down, you are by definition going to drive carbohydrates up. So from this point forward, anytime anybody talks to you about a low-fat diet, just do the translation that low fat means high carbohydrate. So if somebody says to you low fat, just, okay, you're talking about a high carbohydrate diet, which they believe will help you avoid obesity, heart disease, and other common chronic illnesses. How's that been working? Anybody know what this is? Sorry? Yeah, it's a little lancet you can take, get a blood sample, so you can test your blood for glucose level. You can now, with similar sort of device and an appropriate test strip, test your blood ketone levels for people that are monitoring that. So it's estimated that in 6 years, tick, 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 50% of adult Americans are either going to be diabetic or pre-diabetic. There are some estimates that we've already achieved that. And already, diabetes is the 7th leading cause of death in the United States. And it produces $174 billion in cost. And this was based on 2007 data. So any conversation about sustainability that doesn't take this into account is worse than useless. Today, Americans eat less than 60 pounds of beef per person per year. That amounts to less than, or just around 2.5 ounces a day. Would you like to see that increase just a little bit? That's the lowest it's been in my lifetime. At the same time, we eat 129 pounds of caloric sweeteners a year, or a total of over 5.75 about ounces a day. That's sugar and other forms of caloric sweetener. This isn't counting artificial sweeteners. So sugar is about 3 ounces a day, and then what do we have? Almost an equal amount of other caloric sweeteners, corn syrup, honey, maple syrup, whatever you want to call it. Oh, and let's not forget the 240 pounds of other carbohydrate that we ingest, which is over 10.5 ounces a day. So what is a coincidence that we're in the grip of a diabetes epidemic? What is diabetes? An inability to handle carbohydrate. It's a carbohydrate sensitivity. It's, okay. Why are people eating this way? He asks, having given away the answer. This is the 2010 version of the official dietary policy for Americans. This is a product of our HHS and USDA. Started in the early 80s. Remember that date. We'll use it later. In that, we are told to restrict our intake of total fat to less than 30% of calories. We are told to restrict our intake of saturated fat to less than 7% of calories. We are told to restrict our total dietary intake of cholesterol to less than 300 milligrams per day, which is less than you get from 2 large eggs. Let's pause right here while I suck in another breath and say, what's the difference between animal protein and plant protein sources? Hints on the chart here. Saturated fat, cholesterol. Where do we get those from? Animal products or vegetable products? So the first 3 are eat less animal products. That's what that means. Increase our intake of carbohydrates to more than 60% of calories. Where do we get carbohydrates from? Plants or animals? Okay, so not only are we to eat less of these, we're supposed to eat more of those, and we're to promote the use of low-fat milk, lean meat, and the use of meat substitutes in school lunches. So as members of the livestock industry, how does that feel? Your tax dollars hard at work. And again, this is all consistent with what first came out of Senator McGovern's committee in 1977. Well, where did that come from? Oh, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So we had a distinguished visitor in town the other day, just yesterday. Here's a quote from him when he trundled out this latest set of guidelines. The science behind these guidelines is unquestioned, he says. This is policy. And policy is unequal to science. In fact, they're antithetical. Science, when it's operating properly, continually questions itself and says, is what we think is right truly right? Can we disprove ourselves? And if we can disprove ourselves, then we reject what we started with, form a new hypothesis, test it, and keep moving forward. Policy once said, oh, no. No, now we have a tremendous inertia to maintain where we are. And anything that smacks of change, the institutional antibodies rush out to attack it. We've got people's livelihoods and reputations and funding sources at stake here. We can't let this change. I know what you're thinking. After all, I'm a forage agronomist. What do I know? Well, if you actually read the dietary guidelines, you know those things that they're unquestioned? In that document itself, you find the following quote. Isn't that a remarkable statement in a document that's purporting to tell us how to eat so that we will avoid diseases and maintain a healthy weight? It's unquestioned. Well, I got some questions. Like, where did it come from? Well, it came from a book some of you may remember, Diet for a Small Planet. This was a vegetarian, ecologically themed, and yes, I see a common trend here. There are things at work here that tie into other controversies, but we're going to try really hard to just stick with this little topic to talk about today. But that information came into the first report of that Senate Select Committee, which was written by a bunch of young, progressive ideological lawyers who were working as staff members for Senator McGovern. Had no training in nutrition, and they chose one side in the debate because that's what they wanted it to say. And they marginalized the people that came and said, you know, what you're advocating might cause harm. Well, how could it possibly cause harm? Well, let's see. Let's do a little true and false to see if those dietary guidelines are in fact scientifically based. Remember, if we find contradictory evidence, we need to re-examine the hypothesis. So the hypothesis is that eating less saturated fat, eating less cholesterol, eating less animal products will be a healthy diet. Okay? So first question, true, false. Dietary cholesterol has no meaningful effect on total cholesterol levels. True or false? That's true, and we've known it since 1937. It was just too confusing to tell people that they needed to worry about the cholesterol level in their blood, but what they ate made no difference. So to keep the message simple, they lied. I'm serious. I'm dead serious. Why do we have a cholesterol restriction recommendation when we've known this? Low-density lipoprotein cholesterol is a marginal risk factor for coronary heart disease. True or false? Anyone? It's true. Yet why do we test for it? How many people have gone to their doctor and had their doctor tell them that their LDL cholesterol was too high? Higher total cholesterol is associated with greater longevity for women and seniors. Women and seniors, if you have higher cholesterol, you'll live longer. Is that true or false? It's true. Lower total cholesterol is associated with greater cancer mortality. It's true. Might be time to apply a little trend analysis here rather than probability. Saturated fat does not cause heart disease. True or false? Yeah, go with the trend. It's true. Saturated fat and total fat in consumption is in fact positively associated with longevity. The more fat and saturated fat you eat, the longer you'll live. True or false? It's true. A low-fat diet will increase your risk of cardiovascular disease. It's true. High-fat diets produce greater weight loss, better blood glucose control, and reduced cardiovascular disease risks. True or false? Go with it. It's true. If any of this is a surprise to you, you may or may not be comforted by the fact that many of our physicians aren't well educated in nutrition. It's not an emphasized part of their training. They did a survey back in 2003 and asked some general nutrition questions. So, 93% of the physicians who responded did not know that a low-fat diet in general would increase blood triglycerides. 75% did not know that a low-fat diet would decrease HDL cholesterol. 50% thought that a low-fat diet would not change HDL cholesterol. And 50% did not know that carbohydrate was the macronutrient which would most likely raise triglycerides. Brief review: raising blood triglycerides, reducing HDL cholesterol are now understood to be significant indicators of increased coronary vascular disease risk. Oh, and there's one more that probably most of the physicians had never heard of, and that is that carbohydrate-high diets shift the particle size of LDL cholesterol particles, or the LDL particles, shift them from a large, fluffy, relatively benign form to a small, dense, more atherosclerotic form. So in those significant ways represents increasing risk. You've heard about all this, right? Isn't that interesting? We've all been unwitting subjects in a long observational study, the hypothesis of which is that a low-fat, therefore high-carbohydrate diet will reduce obesity, diabetes, and the other so-called diseases of civilization. In my view, it hasn't worked out all that well, which I think is a marvelous understatement. Thank you all for participating, and thank your children, grandchildren, parents. What's been the result of this? Well, this is what it hasn't worked out all that well looks like. Today in the United States, we have 68% of adults either being overweight or obese. In the 80s, it was 15% for obesity. And today it's 35% or more. What happened in the 80s? Sorry? We had our first issue of the dietary guidelines, which we were told to follow so that we wouldn't get obese. Our children, 2 to 19, our rates of obesity and overweight have more than tripled since 1980. We'll just plot these on a graph and start looking for what happened following the institution of the dietary guidelines, which we were told to adopt so that we would avoid obesity and various chronic illnesses. So, how's the incidence of coronary heart disease age-adjusted incidence? Has it gone up or down? Gone up. How about heart failure? Way up. How about stroke? Up. How about cancer? Up. How about obesity and overweight? Yeah, I'd say that's up. Now, I haven't been actively involved in hard research for a while, but my eye is drawn to a certain region of these charts, like where that line goes. What happened there? Well, we know what happened there. Now, it may be something else. Could be a coincidence. But given the fact that prior to the 60s, the only accepted diet for treatment of obesity was carbohydrate restriction. And the very first carbohydrate restriction diet that was published was in 1860s. It has a long history. It has demonstrated efficacy. And today we understand enough about endocrinology, physiology, biochemistry to understand why it works. And all of that was fully elucidated in the 60s when we fully understood the role of insulin in measuring and measuring circulating triglycerides, and we understood fat metabolism finally. But it conflicted with this idea that fat in the diet causes heart disease. And again, we can't let go of a good idea. Diabetes, a little delay from the onset, but that's what happens. By the 30s, 2030. This is what we're looking at coming. This is the unsustainable reality. And notice the diseases that they associate with obesity: type 2 diabetes, coronary heart disease, stroke, hypertension, arthritis. Don't mention it on this, but we'll get to cancer in just a moment. All associated with obesity. So let's briefly review. Dietary fat, whether saturated or not, does not cause heart disease. Carbohydrates do because of their effect on the hormone insulin. Refined carbohydrates, starches, and sugars are the most likely dietary causes of cancer, Alzheimer's disease, and the other common chronic diseases of modern times. There's no meaningful association between meat consumption and cancer. So of course they blame the meat, right? Why might that be? This is my experience, Christmas 2007. I was a 51-year-old, obese, pre-diabetic, balding male. And as a result of eating a diet that contains much more meat and much less carbohydrate than is recommended, I achieved a normal weight, normalized blood sugar, normalized blood lipids, but I'm still balding. Again, the inconvenient truth we'd rather not face, we'll just go pay for the reassuring lie. Remember, the science behind the dietary guidelines is unquestioned. Really? Little problem, we have data going back over 150 years, observations by physicians who were sent out to serve remote populations in various parts of the world. Africa, Asia, the Pacific Islands, North America, South America. What these people who were well-trained were universally struck by is the relative absence of diseases that they were well-trained to recognize. Diseases like cancer. They didn't see it. In fact, for a while you could have papers showing up in the scientific literature wondering what it was about the Inuit, for example, that made them genetically immune to cancer. It was so rare. At first they started talking about these as diseases of civilization, and the rest of the story is they see a nutritional transition take place in those people, and so they get a foodstuff that they hadn't had before, and all of a sudden these diseases start to show up. Okay? At the same time that they don't see the diseases appear in the native people eating their traditional diets, they do see them show up in the Europeans that happen to be living there, and they do see it show up in the natives who are serving the Europeans as domestics, etc. So there's something going on. It's not just environmental. There's something in the diet that's causing. So they started talking about these diseases of civilization, which is an arrogant term, right? It implies the other people aren't civilized. So they started talking about Western diseases. Today, there's this concept of metabolic syndrome. There's a cluster of these diseases. They seem to be metabolic derangements of one form or another. If you have one, you are at increased risk of getting the others. And because of the nature of these diseases, they all lead to premature death, right? Conventional wisdom, the official policy is that obesity raises your risk of these conditions. But people who are active in the field say, no, it's probably more like that it's insulin resistance that plays a part in all of these. Obesity is a symptom of insulin resistance. And here's where it gets really weird. If you have, and not everyone who's insulin resistant, not everyone who's obese is insulin resistant, okay? People who are obese and insulin resistant are at an increased risk of chronic illness. Other diseases show up. But people who are obese but still insulin sensitive are at no greater risk of chronic illness than their lean, insulin-sensitive counterparts. Not everyone who's lean is insulin-sensitive. Those who are lean and insulin-resistant are at greater risk of chronic illness, especially heart disease and failure, than their obese, insulin-resistant counterparts. Insulin resistance seems to be the key thing here. So, metabolic syndrome, if this starts to describe you or someone you love, abdominal obesity, elevated serum triglycerides, depressed HDL cholesterol, elevated blood pressure, fasting blood glucose above 110, some people even say 100. If you have 3 of those 5, you qualify as a diagnosis of metabolic syndrome. But if you have any one of these, what you should know is that a diet rich in your product, restricted in carbohydrate, will produce better improvement in that condition than any medication that we have. And again, this is well demonstrated repeatedly. Here's the cost of metabolic syndrome. Let's look at the list of the leading causes of death in the United States. Remember that list of those Western diseases that was put up? Let's highlight the ones that are arguably related to metabolic syndrome. Begin to get the picture? Oh, just for accuracy, let's include these 2. Just in case we're going to have a realistic discussion of healthcare reform. This is enormous. And you are the industry that's producing the product that we need to base, in part, it doesn't have to be just beef, eggs, poultry, pork, fish, dairy, right? But we're beef eaters, or we used to be. Again, risks for metabolic syndrome. A person who has metabolic syndrome is twice as likely to develop heart disease and 5 times as likely to develop diabetes as someone who doesn't have metabolic syndrome. I'd like to avoid heart disease. I'd like to avoid diabetes. So if I have those conditions, this might be of interest. This is where it gets really exciting or scary, depending on how you want to look at it. Insulin resistance. Chronically elevated levels of insulin are related to cancer. The researchers know this. So, of course, red meat consumption is what is blamed, cancer is blamed on red meat consumption, right? So when you go to McDonald's and you buy the Happy Meal, they're blaming the burger. And they're ignoring the bun, the great big thing of potatoes fried in soybean oil, and the mega tankered, supersized sugar water. Of course it's the meat. This is an interesting article published in Science. Insulin-like growth factor related to, what's going on? Relating to cancer. Diabetics, type 2 diabetics, are at increased risk of getting cancer, and when they get cancer, they are more likely to die of that cancer. Excess body fat seems to account for between 1/4 and 1/2 of the occurrence of many frequently cancer. Why is this advancing on its own? The list is growing. Of course, we've heard about this, right? No, we haven't heard about it, and I think it's high time that we did, as someone who lost both parents to cancer at age 13. So, now, this is why this matters, and this is where it gets tragic. This is the president CEO of Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. On this YouTube video, he says the following overeating fat does not increase cancer rate. So why are we on a low-fat diet? Especially when he says overeating carbohydrates dramatically increases cancer rate. That's his quote. Overeating protein puts you somewhere in between. Of course, we've heard about this, right? And then this quote. That's why we're going to have a huge debate about these carbohydrate-based diets. I would hope so. Remember, a low-fat diet is of what kind? High carbohydrate diet, which he says will increase your rate of cancer. Dramatically increase cancer rate. What's tragic here is he is asked at the end of this presentation, what about people who have a family history of heart disease? And he says, well, then it's really why it's so important that you know what your family history is, because if you have a history of heart disease, then you need to eat the low-fat, therefore high-carbohydrate diet that he knows will dramatically increase your cancer rate, because he believes that the low-fat, therefore high-carbohydrate diet is the heart-healthy diet, despite the evidence that says that that's not true. Imagine his paradigm shift. How many people took soil fertility somewhere along the line? Remember our friend Liebig? Remember his barrel? The idea that something is limiting production, and until you address that limiting factor, then making improvement in the system is going to be limited and not as effective. So here's the example with soil fertility, so that phosphorus had been limiting, now we increase that stave, and now nitrogen is limiting. Something is always going to limit it. Some of those things you can address, some of those you can't, but you need to try to understand what's going on. So permit me to take Liebig's barrel and apply it inverse to human health. Okay, so here's the barrel. Let's say, just for purposes of discussion, that the greatest insult to our health now as a nation is excess carbohydrate in the diet, which leads to things like elevated insulin, insulin resistance. Till we address those, there may be other factors that come in later, but until we address those, we're not going to make a significant improvement in human health. It may be protein deficiency. People are suggesting we need to be getting about 30 grams of protein a meal. 30 grams of protein is about 4 ounces of cooked meat. How much are we eating? Yeah, we're not getting there. The recommendation is for about that much in a day of red meat. So there may be these other factors. But again, so now I'm going to ask you the question, is the problem likely to be the grain-fed cattle or the grain-fed people? So let's explore a few more things here. There are common things that are out there. We have a number of other topics that are abuzz and are used to denigrate beef in one way or another. Let's look at these ratios. Everybody heard of omega-6 and omega-3? And omega-6 is thought to be pro-inflammatory, and omega-3 is thought to act against the effect. So we need these fats, they're essential, but we don't need too much of them, and we want them in the right proportion. And people talk about grass-fed beef as having this desirable omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, and they frequently talk as if it's a very uniform, stable thing. My point here is there's great variation. And it depends on a lot of things, including the breed, the season, the sex, the muscle, all kinds of, let alone the management, okay? So we have this tremendously variable commodity that a lot of people are putting a lot of emphasis in. And it's true, you can measure these things, I'm not denying that. And somewhere somebody said the desirable ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 is 4:1. Believe me, you can question that, but that's what's been given. It comes from the Harvard people who gave us a lot of nonsense, so just treat that. But here you can see on the far side, or the right, my right, your left, the shortest bar is grass-fed beef from the work that Dr. Duckett and her colleagues have done. And you can see it's well below that. The interesting thing is that their grain-fed beef is only a little bit above that. How important is that difference? I don't think we're even close to knowing what that is. And if you go to a store-bought ribeye, you see that it's a little higher. And then you can see some other things like soybean oil here, the chicken breast, the skinless chicken breast, the chicken thighs, and then the pork chop. Now, if somebody wants to be consuming grass-fed beef because of its desirable omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, that's fine, but they shouldn't be eating chicken and beef. I'm not saying not to eat chicken and beef. I love me pig. But let's be consistent with your logic here. And if you only focus on the ratios, then you miss what you're actually getting. Remember that soybean oil? That wasn't too bad, was it? Until you look at the load of omega-6 that you're getting from soybean oil. And look at how little of either you're getting from beef. Beef is not a rich source of omega-6 or omega-3, regardless of how it's produced. And so we should not be denigrating one segment of our industry to promote our niche product, is all I'm trying to say. It's a great part of a diet. Eat it, love it. But this isn't something to promote it on, in my opinion. In fact, if you look at the ounces of cooked ground beef you'd have to consume to supply the omega-3 provided by 1 ounce of cooked wild-caught Atlantic salmon, conventional beef, you'd have to eat 143 ounces to equal 1. Yes, grass-fed is better. It's only 48 ounces to equal 1. So probably you shouldn't look to beef of either function or either form, grass-fed, grain-fed, for your omega-3. Sorry. And then, let's take it one step further. Let's look at how much of that salmon we'd have to eat in order to get enough omega-3 to balance out the omega-6 that we're getting from any one of these vegetable oils that we're told are healthy for us, that we should be consuming instead of lard or tallow or butter. Let's just take that soybean oil. You'd have to consume 19 ounces of cooked salmon to get enough omega-3 to balance out the omega-6 that you got in 1 serving, which is 2 tablespoons. That's salad dressing. So how important is grass-fed beef if you're still eating this stuff? It's not the short stave of the barrel. This is the short stave of the barrel, the vegetable oils in our diet. Why are we eating them? Because they don't have cholesterol, they don't have saturated fat, they're healthy, right? You're familiar with this kind of information about people are concerned about hormones in implanted beef. You can look at the hormone production of healthy human beings, and then you can say, okay, how much do you get from a serving of beef, implanted or not implanted? Really? That's going to be a meaningful difference? Well, how about other sources of hormones in the human diet? How many pounds of that implanted beef would you need to eat to provide the estrogen provided by 3 ounces of the following items? Well, cabbage, you'd have to eat 22 pounds. chicken eggs, you'd have to eat 29 pounds. Soybean, don't even talk to me if you're eating soybeans. Just don't. We'll get along better. Implanted beef is not the limiting stage. Right, yeah, we're going to blame the early onset of puberty on the implanted beef while we're eating the soy milk and the tofu and cooking in... God, please. And you could look at each one of these nitrate, so instead of adding potassium nitrate, we're going to take beet juice or celery juice and use that. Oh, that's much better. Sorry, back up. E. coli, there was the buzz about grass feeding would eliminate E. coli. It doesn't. Residues, pesticides, and antibiotics, and again, thank you. Again, these issues really aren't. They're all part of the we know eating meat is bad meme, the narrative. So, red meat, heart healthy. You won't see the AHA heart check logo, but the evidence is that eating a diet high in your product, restricted in carbohydrate, will improve your blood lipid profile, will help you regain insulin sensitivity, will help normalize blood sugar. So it's health food, meat is medicine. So what's next? Become educated. I hope I've been helpful. I hope I've gotten some juices flowing to start the conversation, and I'm more than happy to help the conversation continue. Here's one book that I recommend for people to start their journey, Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It. If I've got 2 copies with me that I will not be taking home, so if you'd really like one, if you're in a position to help spread the information in your community or organization, please come talk to me. Gain experience, and if necessary, if those 5 symptoms of metabolic syndrome, made you a little nervous, then I would recommend that you read a book like this one. This is the diet that I've mostly followed since Christmas of '77. Okay, but there's lots and lots and lots of carbohydrate-restricted diets, right? So don't get necessarily tied to any one of them. Challenge the narrative. We're on school boards, we serve in our communities, maybe we teach, whatever, and if you hear the Meatless Monday or whatever, start challenging it. But by the way, your industry is promoting 29 lean cuts of beef. Right? Your industry is talking about how your product can fit in the heart-healthy diet. I'd really like somebody to start having conversations around, is that really a good idea? To be tying yourself to something that's so demonstrably flawed. Find your position of influence. I hope I've found mine. It's a wide tent. Let's find a way to push this forward. So, pause for questions, but also at this point, I'll leave this up during the Q&A session. Anybody who's got a QR code scanner on their smartphone, you can, whoa, come back. I'm going to set this down and see if I'm doing... So the one on the far side from me, the KCA, that's essentially today's slide set as a PDF. The one closest to me is a PDF of the slide set from AFGC, the beginning of the week, where we had Dr. Duckett and Adele Height. And then the one in the middle is a poster that I gave at the International Grassland Council in Australia. So, and if you can't do that, if your 4-year-old isn't here with their smartphone, then send me an email or contact Dr. Lacefield, and I'll be happy to get you the links that let you get that. So thank you very much for your attention, and we're now...